The unforgiving Montana sun beat down on the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Sarah Blackwood stood frozen on the courthouse steps, the judge's words still ringing in her ears. Her knuckles had turned white from gripping her shawl, and she could feel the stares of townsfolk boring into her back. Judge Harmon Wilson had just delivered his ruling. She was to marry Franklin Moore, the prosperous wheat farmer whose family had substantial influence in the county. The year was 1876, and in this corner of the Montana Territory, a woman alone was considered not just vulnerable, but a burden on society. Especially a woman like Sarah, whose father had left nothing but debts when typhoid took him 3 months prior. "The court has decided what's best for you, Miss Blackwood," Judge Wilson had declared, stroking his gray beard with an air of finality. "Mr. Moore has graciously offered to take responsibility for your father's debts and provide you with a respectable home. You'll be wed this coming Sunday after services." The judge had looked down at her over his spectacles as if daring her to object. But Sarah had been too shocked to speak. Now, as she descended the courthouse steps on trembling legs, her mind raced with desperate thoughts of escape from a future being handed to a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. "Sarah!" The voice cut through her thoughts. Martha Jenkins, the widow who owned the boarding house where Sarah had taken refuge after selling her father's modest home to pay some of his creditors, approached with concern etched on her weathered face. "Child, you look pale as a ghost. Come, let's get you out of this heat." Martha took Sarah's arm and guided her away from the prying eyes that had gathered to witness her humiliation. "I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this channel, and I'm curious, what city are you watching from?" Martha led Sarah to her small wagon hitched near the general store. "I heard what happened in there," she said quietly, helping Sarah onto the wooden seat. "That old buzzard has no right to order you to marry anyone." Sarah nodded numbly, watching as Silver Creek's Main Street, with its saloon, general store, and small bank, receded behind them. The town had been her home all her 23 years. But now it felt like a prison. Her father, despite his failings, had never suggested she marry for convenience or financial security. He had taught her to read, to think for herself, rare traits encouraged in women in these parts. "There's another way," Martha said suddenly, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I wasn't going to tell you, but seeing what that judge is forcing on you." She glanced around nervously before continuing. "They're bringing him in today, Caleb Dawson." The name hung in the air between them. Everyone in 3 territories knew of Caleb Dawson, the mountain man who'd been captured after evading the law for years. They said he'd killed 3 men in a dispute over a gold claim near Helena, though rumors persisted that he'd been framed by powerful mining interests who wanted his claim. Sarah's heart quickened at the mention of Dawson. She'd seen him once, years ago, when he'd come to town for supplies. Tall and broad-shouldered, with intense blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He had an untamed quality that had made her father mutter disapprovingly and pull her away. But Sarah had never forgotten him, or the stories that followed him, of his skill as a tracker, his fairness in business dealings with the Blackfoot tribes, and his refusal to bow to the mining companies that were gradually taking control of Montana's future. As the wagon rattled along the rutted road toward the boarding house on the edge of town, Martha explained her plan in hushed tones. "Judge Wilson will be presiding over Dawson's trial tomorrow. Everyone knows he'll hang. The mining companies have paid for that verdict. But there's a territorial law that says a condemned man can be released into a woman's custody if she agrees to marry him and take responsibility for his rehabilitation. Martha's eyes gleamed with a mixture of mischief and determination. It's rarely invoked, but it's still on the books. My late husband was clerk of court for 20 years. I've seen it done once before. Sarah stared at Martha in disbelief as the implications of what she was suggesting sank in. You want me to marry Caleb Dawson? A man facing the gallows? But even as she said it, something stirred inside her. A wild, reckless feeling that felt strangely like hope. If she had to bind herself to a man, wouldn't it be better to choose one herself rather than accept the judge's decree? At least with Dawson, there would be no pretense of propriety, no suffocating expectations of becoming a farmer's docile wife. It would be a risk, Martha admitted as they arrived at the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. But think on it, girl. Judge Wilson can hardly force you to marry Mr. Moore if you're already wed to another. She helped Sarah down from the wagon, adding in a whisper, they're bringing Dawson through town at sunset. They'll hold him in the jail until the trial tomorrow. If you want to see him, to decide, that would be your chance. The hours crawled by as Sarah paced the small room she rented from Martha, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Through her window, she could see Franklin Moore's sprawling farmhouse on the distant hillside. It was a fine home, she had to admit, solid, respectable, promising comfort and security. But the thought of being there, of being Franklin's wife, made her chest tighten with something akin to panic. Franklin was not cruel, but he was stern and humorless, 20 years her senior, with grown sons from his first marriage who looked at Sarah with undisguised resentment whenever their paths crossed in town. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah made her decision. She changed into her best dress, a simple blue calico that her father had always said matched her eyes, and pinned her dark hair up neatly. If she was going to propose marriage to a condemned man, she would at least look dignified doing so. Martha gave her a knowing look as she descended the stairs, but asked no questions, merely pressing a small, leather-bound Bible into her hands. For luck, the older woman said, with a gentle squeeze of Sarah's fingers. The crowd that had gathered along Silver Creek's main street was larger than Sarah had anticipated. Word of Caleb Dawson's capture had spread quickly, drawing curious onlookers from farms and ranches for miles around. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound of approaching horses reached her ears. Sheriff Thomas Reed led the procession on his dappled gray gelding, his expression grim beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him rode 2 deputy marshals, dust-covered and alert, their rifles resting across their saddles. And between them, hands shackled and attached by a chain to one deputy's saddle horn, rode Caleb Dawson. 5 years had passed since Sarah had glimpsed him in town, and those years had left their mark. A jagged scar now ran along his left jawline, and strands of silver threaded through his dark hair, though he couldn't have been more than 35. But his bearing remained proud, his broad shoulders unbowed despite his chains. Unlike the lawmen, who wore trail dusters over their clothes, Dawson was dressed simply in a buckskin shirt and worn denim pants. A murmur rippled through the crowd as they passed, some spectators hurling insults, while others simply stared at the notorious mountain man with morbid fascination. As the procession neared where Sarah stood, something made Dawson turn his head. For a fleeting moment, his ice-blue eyes met hers, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. Not because they knew each other, but because they recognized something in each other. In that instant, she knew her decision was made. Whatever Caleb Dawson might be, he was not a man who would meekly accept the fate others had decreed for him. Neither would she. Sheriff Reed and his prisoners passed, continuing toward the small jailhouse at the far end of the street. Sarah waited until the crowd began to disperse before making her way in the same direction. The jail was a squat stone building with barred windows, one of the few structures in Silver Creek built to last. Deputy Marshal Jenkins, no relation to Martha despite sharing her surname, stood guard at the door, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. He straightened as Sarah approached, surprise evident on his sunburned face. "Miss Blackwood, this ain't no place for a lady right now. We've got Dawson locked up tight, and the sheriff doesn't want any trouble before the trial." He shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze, clearly confused by her presence. "I need to speak with the prisoner, Deputy," Sarah said, impressed by the steadiness of her own voice. "It's a matter of some importance." When the deputy began to shake his head, she added, "It concerns the territorial statute regarding rehabilitation bonds for condemned men. I believe Judge Wilson would want to be consulted on the matter before tomorrow's proceedings." The mention of the judge gave the deputy pause. Like most men with a badge in the territory, he was more accustomed to enforcing the law than understanding its finer points. "You wait here," he said finally. "I'll speak to the sheriff." He disappeared inside, leaving Sarah to wonder if her nerve would hold until he returned. It had to. This was likely her only chance. Sheriff Reed emerged moments later, his craggy face a mask of confusion. "Miss Blackwood, what's this nonsense Jenkins tells me about you invoking a rehabilitation statute?" His tone was not unkind, but it held a note of paternal condescension that Sarah had grown wearily familiar with since her father's passing. Sarah squared her shoulders, meeting the lawman's gaze directly. "It's not nonsense, Sheriff. Territorial Code, Section 12, Paragraph 8, states that a condemned man may be released into the custody of a woman of good standing if she agrees to marry him and take responsibility for his moral rehabilitation. I wish to discuss this possibility with Mr. Dawson before his trial." She recited the law as Martha had instructed her, praying the sheriff wouldn't ask to see the specific code, a bluff she couldn't back up. The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Good Lord, girl, have you lost your senses? This is Caleb Dawson we're talking about, a killer, an outlaw. Why in heaven's name would you entertain such a notion?" He studied her face with genuine concern, as if looking for signs of fever or derangement. "My reasons are my own, Sheriff," Sarah replied quietly. "But I assure you, I am of sound mind. I simply wish to speak with him." She clutched Martha's Bible tightly, drawing strength from its solid presence in her hands. "Unless you can cite a law preventing such a conversation, I believe I have the right to at least present my proposal to the prisoner." Sheriff Reed sighed heavily, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning hair. "I can't claim to know all the territorial statutes by heart, Miss Blackwood. If such a law exists, it's Judge Wilson who will have the final say on its application." He studied her for another long moment before reluctantly stepping aside. 5 minutes, he conceded, "and I'll be standing right outside the cell the entire time." His expression softened slightly as he added, "Your father was a good man, Sarah. He wouldn't want to see you throw your life away on some misguided rescue mission." The interior of the jailhouse was cool and dim after the bright sunlight outside. It smelled of old sweat, tobacco, and the acrid tang of the lye soap used to scrub the stone floors. 2 cells lined the back wall, only one of which was occupied. Caleb Dawson sat on a narrow cot, his shackled hands resting on his knees. He looked up as Sarah entered, and she was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes, now regarding her with wary curiosity. "Mr. Dawson," Sheriff Reed announced, "you have a visitor. Miss Sarah Blackwood wishes to speak with you." The lawman took up position by the cell door, his hand never straying far from his holstered Colt. Dawson rose to his full height, towering over both Sarah and the sheriff. His movements were fluid, despite the chains that bound his wrists and ankles. "Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged with a slight nod, his voice deeper than Sarah had expected, with the hint of an accent she couldn't place. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't," Sarah admitted, stepping closer to the cell bars, ignoring Sheriff Reed's disapproving frown. "But I have a proposition for you, Mr. Dawson, if you're willing to hear it." She kept her voice low, though she knew the sheriff would hear every word. It didn't matter. Once she made her intentions known, there would be no keeping them secret. A flicker of interest crossed Dawson's weathered face. "I'm facing the gallows tomorrow, Miss Blackwood. I'm in no position to refuse hearing any proposition." Despite his circumstances, there was no desperation in his tone, only a calm acceptance that impressed Sarah more than any plea for help might have. She drew a deep breath and spoke the words that would irrevocably alter her future. "There is a territorial law that allows a condemned man to be released into a woman's custody if she agrees to marry him and take responsibility for his rehabilitation." The words tumbled out faster than she intended, fueled by nervousness. "I am proposing such an arrangement between us." The shock on Dawson's face would have been comical under different circumstances. Behind her, Sheriff Reed made a strangled sound of disbelief. Sarah pressed on before either man could interrupt. "I don't know if you're guilty of the crimes they've accused you of, Mr. Dawson. And frankly, at this moment, it doesn't matter. I find myself in need of a husband to escape an unwanted marriage arranged by Judge Wilson. You need to escape the gallows. I believe we can help each other." Dawson studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Blackwood, I've received some unusual offers in my time, but this surely ranks among the most surprising." He moved closer to the bars, lowering his voice so that his next words were for her alone. "Are you certain about this? You don't know me. The things they say I've done?" "I'm not certain of anything," Sarah interrupted with brutal honesty, "except that I won't be forced into marrying Franklin Moore by a judge who thinks he knows what's best for me. At least with you, it would be my choice." She met his gaze steadily, willing him to understand what she couldn't fully articulate, that this was as much about claiming her own agency as it was about saving him. The mountain man nodded slowly, something like respect kindling in his eyes. "Then, Miss Blackwood, I accept your proposition, though I feel bound to warn you. The mining companies that want me gone won't take kindly to having their plans thwarted. Marrying me might save you from one fate, but it could expose you to dangers you haven't considered." "That's enough," Sheriff Reed interjected, stepping forward to grasp Sarah's elbow. "This conversation is over. Miss Blackwood, I don't know what foolishness has gotten into you, but I won't stand by and let you ruin your life this way." His face had flushed red with anger or concern, perhaps both. Sarah pulled her arm free, fixing the sheriff with a determined stare. "The law allows this, Sheriff Reed, and I intend to petition Judge Wilson first thing tomorrow morning, before the trial begins." She turned back to Dawson, whose expression had shifted to one of cautious hope. "I'll return tomorrow, Mr. Dawson. Please consider carefully what I've proposed. Once done, it cannot be undone easily. With those words, she allowed Sheriff Reed to usher her out of the jailhouse and into the fading daylight. As they emerged, the sheriff turned to her, his weathered face creased with genuine worry. "Sarah, listen to me. Whatever trouble you think you're in with Judge Wilson's ruling, it can be sorted out. There are other options besides throwing your lot in with a man like Dawson." "Are there, Sheriff?" Sarah asked quietly. "In this town, in this territory, what options does a woman alone truly have? To marry where I'm told? To work as a laundress or a seamstress until my hands are raw and my eyes fail?" She shook her head, a newfound determination straightening her spine. "At least this way, I choose my own path." Sheriff Reed removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair in frustration. "I'll have to report this to Judge Wilson immediately. You know that, don't you?" When Sarah nodded, he sighed heavily. "Go home, girl. Think on this overnight. Tomorrow, you may see things differently." But as Sarah walked back toward Martha's boarding house, she knew her mind was made up. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it on her own terms, not those dictated by Judge Wilson or the expectations of Silver Creek society. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt something like freedom stirring in her heart. Martha was waiting anxiously on the porch when Sarah returned, rushing down the steps to meet her. "Well, did you see him? Did you speak with Dawson?" Her eyes were bright with excitement or trepidation, perhaps both. Sarah nodded, suddenly exhausted as the tension of the day caught up with her. "I did. I told him about the law, about my proposal." She sank onto the porch steps, the wooden boards warm beneath her. "He accepted." Martha exhaled sharply, sinking down beside Sarah. "Lord have mercy. I never thought you'd actually go through with it." She patted Sarah's hand, adding with grudging admiration, "You've got more spine than most men in this town, that's certain." After a moment's pause, she asked, "What did he seem like to you?" "Dawson, I mean, up close." The question gave Sarah pause. What had Caleb Dawson seemed like? Dangerous, certainly. There was a coiled tension about him that suggested he was accustomed to violence. But there had been something else, too. Intelligence in those piercing blue eyes, and a dignity that his chains couldn't diminish. He seemed alert, present, like someone who notices everything. She struggled to put her impressions into words. "Not what I expected from an outlaw." Martha nodded sagely. "My Henry always said there was something different about Dawson, said he wasn't like the other rough men who came through these parts." She squeezed Sarah's shoulder gently. "What happens now?" "Tomorrow morning, I'll go to Judge Wilson's chambers before court convenes. I'll formally invoke the statute and request to marry Dawson instead of Franklin Moore." Sarah tried to sound more confident than she felt. "The law is clear. The judge should have no grounds to refuse." "Should have no grounds," Martha repeated with a wry smile. "But Harmon Wilson has never been one to let the letter of the law interfere with his own notions of how things ought to be." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "Come inside. You'll need your strength for tomorrow. I'll fix you a proper supper, and then you should rest." Sleep eluded Sarah that night. She lay awake, listening to the distant howl of coyotes and the occasional shouts from the saloon several streets away. Had she lost her mind? Was she truly preparing to bind her life to a stranger, an accused murderer, rather than accept the marriage Judge Wilson had arranged? Yet whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the quiet determination in Caleb Dawson's eyes, so different from the smug certainty in Judge Wilson's or the bland expectation in Franklin Moore's. Whatever else he might be, Dawson had looked at her as a person making her own choice, not as a problem to be solved or a possession to be claimed. By dawn, Sarah was dressed and ready, wearing her mother's wedding dress, a simple gown of ivory satin, somewhat yellowed with age, but still elegant. Martha helped her with the tiny pearl buttons down the back, her usually steady hands trembling slightly. "Are you certain, child?" she asked one final time. "Once you stand before the judge and make this request, there's no turning back. Silver Creek has a long memory." "I'm certain," Sarah replied, meeting Martha's concerned gaze in the small mirror. "More certain than I've been of anything since Father died." She touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's, the only jewelry she owned of any value. "He raised me to think for myself, to make my own choices. I think he would understand this one, even if he wouldn't approve." Martha nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Well then, let's get you to the courthouse. Judge Wilson holds his chambers at 7:30 sharp, and it wouldn't do to be late for your own wedding." She attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. However unconventional it might be, the courthouse was quiet when they arrived, most of the town still at breakfast or attending to morning chores. Only Clerk Harris, a thin man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, occupied the main hall, sorting papers for the day's proceedings. He looked up in surprise as Sarah and Martha entered, his eyes widening at Sarah's wedding attire. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," Sarah said with more composure than she felt. "I need to speak with Judge Wilson before court convenes. It's a matter of some urgency." Harris blinked owlishly behind his spectacles. "The judge is in his chambers, Miss Blackwood, but he's not receiving visitors. He's preparing for the Dawson trial." His gaze slid to her dress, confusion evident on his narrow face. "If I may ask, why are you—" "Thank you, Mr. Harris," Martha interrupted smoothly. "We'll announce ourselves." She guided Sarah toward the heavy oak door marked Judge's Chambers before the clerk could object further. She rapped firmly on the door, ignoring Harris's sputtered protests. "Enter!" Judge Wilson's voice boomed from within. Sarah squared her shoulders, exchanged one final glance with Martha, and pushed open the door. Judge Wilson sat behind a massive desk, legal texts and documents spread before him. Sheriff Reed stood nearby, his expression darkening when he saw Sarah. Clearly, he had already informed the judge of her intentions. Franklin Moore was there too, his tall frame stiff with outrage, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "Miss Blackwood," Judge Wilson began without preamble, "Sheriff Reed has apprised me of your unusual request. I had hoped a night's reflection might have restored your senses." His bushy eyebrows drew together as he took in her wedding dress. "Apparently, I was mistaken." Sarah stepped forward, keenly aware of every eye upon her. "Your Honor, I wish to formally invoke Territorial Code, Section 12, Paragraph 8, which allows a woman of good standing to take responsibility for a condemned man through marriage. I am here to request permission to marry Caleb Dawson in lieu of the arrangement you proposed with Mr. Moore." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Wilson's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. Franklin Moore took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "Judge, you can't possibly entertain this madness. The girl is clearly not in her right mind." "The girl," Sarah said evenly, meeting Moore's glare, "is standing right here and is quite capable of making her own decisions." She turned back to the judge. "The law is clear, Your Honor. You cannot force me to marry Mr. Moore if I choose to marry another." Judge Wilson leaned forward, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of his desk. "The law is meant to serve justice, Miss Blackwood, not to be manipulated by foolish young women who don't understand what's best for them." His voice was dangerously low. Caleb Dawson is a criminal, a murderer who has evaded justice for years. He will hang this day, as he deserves. You haven't even held his trial yet, Sarah observed, struggling to keep her voice steady. Isn't he entitled to due process before you pronounce his sentence? She reached into the small reticule she carried, withdrawing a folded document. I have here a copy of the territorial statute, marked with the relevant passage. Martha Jenkins' late husband served as court clerk for 20 years. He kept meticulous records of the territorial codes. The judge snatched the document from her hands, his eyes scanning the text with increasing fury. After a moment, he slammed it down on his desk. This statute was intended for minor offenders, not men like Dawson. It was meant to address cases where rehabilitation was a reasonable expectation. The text makes no such distinction, Your Honor, Sarah countered quietly. It refers only to condemned men without specifying the nature of their crimes. She had rehearsed these arguments through the sleepless night, drawing on her father's teachings about the importance of precise language in legal matters. Sheriff Reed stepped forward, his expression troubled. Judge Wilson, I've consulted the territorial marshal on this matter. He confirms that the statute exists and has been invoked successfully in the past. If Miss Blackwood persists in her request, and if Dawson agrees, the law does allow for this arrangement. The judge's face contorted with rage. This is absurd. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus by a headstrong girl and a murderer. He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. You will marry Franklin Moore as directed, or you will face contempt charges. On what grounds? Martha spoke up from where she stood by the door, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, you know my Henry served this court faithfully for 2 decades. He taught me enough about the law to know you cannot hold someone in contempt for exercising a legal right explicitly provided by territorial statute. Franklin Moore took another step forward, looming over Sarah. This has gone far enough. Sarah, you will come with me now. We'll sort this nonsense out later. He reached for her arm, but Sarah stepped back, keeping herself beyond his grasp. I will do no such thing, Mr. Moore, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. I have made my choice, as is my right. I will marry Caleb Dawson. She turned back to the judge, who appeared on the verge of apoplexy. Your Honor, will you uphold the law, or will you violate it to impose your will? For a moment, it seemed Judge Wilson might actually strike her. Then, with visible effort, he mastered his temper. Very well, he said through clenched teeth. If you are determined to ruin yourself, I cannot legally prevent it. But know this, if Dawson ever sets foot in Silver Creek again after today, statute or no statute, he will face the consequences of his crimes. He glared at Sarah, adding, and you, Miss Blackwood, will find that choices have consequences of their own. Sarah inclined her head slightly, accepting the implicit threat without responding to it. Thank you, Your Honor. I request that the marriage take place immediately before any other proceedings concerning Mr. Dawson. The judge slammed his gavel down on the desk with such force that everyone in the room flinched. Sheriff, bring the prisoner. We'll conduct this farce in the courtroom and then be done with it. He rose, gathering his robes around him like armor. Mr. Moore, I apologize for this unfortunate development. Rest assured, Miss Blackwood's behavior today will not soon be forgotten in Silver Creek. Franklin Moore's face was a mask of cold fury as he stared at Sarah. You'll regret this decision, he said quietly. When Dawson shows his true nature, and he will, don't come crying for help. You've made your bed, quite literally. Without waiting for a response, he stormed from the chamber, nearly colliding with Clerk Harris, who hovered anxiously in the doorway. Judge Wilson swept past Sarah without another glance, barking at Harris to prepare the courtroom. Sheriff Reed hesitated, looking at Sarah with a mixture of disappointment and grudging respect. "I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Blackwood," he said softly, before following the judge. Martha hurried to Sarah's side as soon as they were alone. "You did it, girl. I never thought Wilson would back down, law or no law." She squeezed Sarah's hands, which were trembling now that the confrontation was over. "Are you ready for what comes next? Once those vows are spoken, he'll be your husband in truth." Was she ready? The enormity of what she was about to do crashed over Sarah like a wave. In less than an hour, she would be Mrs. Caleb Dawson, legally bound to a man she barely knew. A man wanted in 3 territories for murder. But the alternative, submitting to Judge Wilson's decree, becoming Franklin Moore's obedient wife, was unthinkable. "I'm ready," she said, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "Whatever comes, at least it will be of my own choosing." The courtroom filled quickly as word spread through Silver Creek. By the time Sheriff Reed escorted Caleb Dawson in, still shackled at wrists and ankles, it seemed the entire town had gathered to witness the spectacle. Sarah stood alone at the front of the room, feeling the weight of disapproving stares. Martha had taken a seat in the front row, offering silent support with her presence. Dawson's eyes found Sarah immediately, widening slightly at the sight of her in her mother's wedding dress. As the sheriff led him to stand beside her, he murmured, "You went through with it. I wasn't sure you would." There was genuine wonder in his voice, and something else, a respect that made Sarah stand a little straighter. "I keep my word, Mr. Dawson," she replied softly. "I expect you'll do the same." Before he could respond, Judge Wilson banged his gavel, calling for silence in the packed courtroom. "We are gathered here to witness a most unusual proceeding," he announced, making no effort to hide his distaste. "Miss Sarah Blackwood has invoked Territorial Code, Section 12, Paragraph 8, requesting to marry the prisoner, Caleb Dawson, and take responsibility for his rehabilitation, in lieu of the execution scheduled for today." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and the judge banged his gavel again impatiently. "While I find this request deeply misguided, the law does allow for such an arrangement. Therefore, we will proceed with the marriage ceremony, after which Mr. Dawson will be released into Miss Blackwood's custody. However," he added, fixing Dawson with a steely glare, "should Mr. Dawson commit any further offenses or attempt to flee, the original sentence will be immediately reinstated." The judge set aside his papers with an irritated gesture. "I will now conduct the briefest ceremony the law allows. Caleb Dawson, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, understanding that your life now depends upon fulfilling your obligations in this marriage?" Dawson straightened to his full height, the chains at his wrists clinking softly. "I do," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "and I swear to honor the trust she's placing in me today." Judge Wilson's mouth tightened at this unexpected declaration. "Sarah Blackwood, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, understanding that you assume full responsibility for his behavior and rehabilitation?" Sarah turned slightly to face Dawson, meeting his intense blue gaze. In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but a solemn promise, one man to another, as equals embarking on an uncertain journey together. "I do," she said clearly, her voice unwavering despite the racing of her heart. "Then by the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Wilson slammed his gavel down with unnecessary force. "Sheriff Reed, remove the prisoner's shackles," He is now in his wife's custody." The judge's emphasis on the word wife dripped with sarcasm. As Sheriff Reed reluctantly unlocked Dawson's restraints, a strange hush fell over the courtroom. It was as if the entire town held its breath, waiting to see what the infamous mountain man would do with his newfound freedom. Dawson rubbed his wrists where the manacles had chafed them raw, then slowly, deliberately, offered his arm to Sarah. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "shall we depart?" Sarah placed her hand on his offered arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin sleeve. "Yes, Mr. Dawson," she replied with equal deliberation. "I believe we shall." Together, they walked down the center aisle of the courthouse, past the stunned faces of Silver Creek's residents. No one spoke, but Sarah could feel the judgment in their stares, the certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. Only Martha Jenkins smiled as they passed, a small nod of approval for Sarah's courage. Outside, the morning sun had risen high in a cloudless Montana sky. Sarah paused at the top of the courthouse steps, suddenly uncertain. She had been so focused on executing her plan that she hadn't thought about what would happen immediately after. Where would they go? What would they do? Her father's house had been sold to pay his debts, and her room at Martha's boarding house was hardly suitable for a married couple. As if reading her thoughts, Dawson leaned down to speak quietly in her ear. "My horse should still be in the livery stable where the sheriff's men left him, a big black gelding with a white star on his forehead. If you're willing to ride double, we can be well away from Silver Creek by nightfall." He straightened, adding with unexpected gentleness, "Unless you've changed your mind about leaving. This is your home, after all." Sarah looked out over the dusty main street of Silver Creek, the town where she had spent all her 23 years. She thought of her father's grave in the small cemetery on the hill, the only thing that truly tied her to this place now. "No," she said finally, "there's nothing for me here anymore." She turned to face her new husband, this stranger to whom she had just bound her life. "Lead the way, Mr. Dawson. I'm ready." Caleb studied her face for a moment, as if searching for any sign of hesitation or regret. Finding none, he nodded once, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then let's go meet Midnight. He's not accustomed to carrying two, but he's strong. He'll manage until we can find you a mount of your own." As they walked toward the livery stable at the edge of town, Sarah felt the weight of stares following them. From windows, from the boardwalk, from riders passing on the street, word was spreading rapidly. By sundown, everyone within 50 miles would know that Sarah Blackwood had defied Judge Wilson's decree and married the notorious Caleb Dawson instead. "They'll talk about this for years," she murmured, half to herself. "The judge's face when I produced that statute." Beside her, Dawson chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound from a man with such a fearsome reputation. "I imagine it's not often Harmon Wilson is outmaneuvered in his own courtroom, especially by a woman." He glanced down at her, curiosity evident in his expression. "Where did you learn about that law? It's not exactly common knowledge." "Martha Jenkins told me." Her husband was court clerk for 20 years. She remembered seeing it invoked once before. Sarah hesitated, then added honestly, "She suggested it when she heard what Judge Wilson was trying to force me into. I think she always had a soft spot for you, though I'm not sure why." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. Henry Jenkins was a fair man, one of the few in these parts who would look you in the eye, regardless of the rumors following your name. He fell silent as they approached the livery stable, where a gangly stable boy of perhaps 15 gaped openly at them. "Mr. Dawson, the boy exclaimed, a mixture of fear and awe in his voice. "They said you was to hang today." "Change of plans, Tommy," Dawson replied easily. "Is Midnight still here?" "The black with the star?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir, in the back stall. Fed and watered him myself this morning." His eyes darted to Sarah, widening further at her wedding dress. "Miss Blackwood, what are you—" "Mrs. Dawson now, Tommy," Caleb corrected him gently. "We'll be needing Midnight saddled if you don't mind, and whatever gear of mine the sheriff's men brought in with him." Tommy's jaw dropped even further, but years of stable work had taught him to follow instructions first and ask questions later. He scurried off to prepare the horse, casting bewildered glances over his shoulder as he went. Left momentarily alone with her new husband, Sarah found herself suddenly tongue-tied. What did one say to a man one had just married under such extraordinary circumstances? Fortunately, Dawson spoke first. "I owe you my life," he said simply, turning to face her fully. "That's a debt I take seriously, Sarah. I want you to know that." The use of her given name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "I don't know what lies ahead for us, but I give you my word. I'll keep you safe, and I'll never give you cause to regret what you did today." Before Sarah could respond, Tommy reappeared leading a magnificent black gelding, already saddled and equipped with saddlebags and a bedroll. The horse was larger than any Sarah had ridden before, with powerful shoulders and intelligent eyes that regarded her with obvious curiosity. "This is Midnight," Dawson said, taking the reins from Tommy with a nod of thanks. He ran a hand along the horse's glossy neck, and the animal nickered softly in recognition. "He and I have been together for 8 years. He's never carried a lady before, but he'll learn." He turned to Sarah. "Can you ride astride? It'll be easier than side saddle, especially where we're heading." Sarah had ridden astride many times as a girl, much to her father's chagrin, though always in pants borrowed from one of the neighbor boys. Never in a dress, certainly never in a wedding dress. "I can manage," she said, gathering her mother's gown in one hand. "But I'll need help mounting." Dawson nodded, turning to the stable boy. "Tommy, would you mind looking the other way for a moment? Mrs. Dawson needs to make some adjustments to her attire." The boy blushed scarlet and promptly turned his back. Sarah hitched her wedding dress up to her knees, securing it with the sash from her reticule to keep it from tangling around her legs when mounted. It was hardly proper, but then nothing about this day had followed the dictates of propriety. "Ready," she announced, and Dawson turned to her, his expression softening at the sight of her determination. Without a word, he linked his hands together to form a stirrup. Sarah placed her boot in his palms, and he boosted her up onto Midnight's back with surprising gentleness for a man of his strength. The saddle was not designed for a woman's comfort, but Sarah shifted until she found a tolerable position. Dawson swung up behind her with practiced ease, his chest warm against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath stirring the tendrils of hair that had escaped from beneath her bonnet. "As much as can be expected," Sarah replied, acutely aware of their proximity. This man was her husband now, for better or worse. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. With a click of his tongue, Dawson urged Midnight forward. They rode out of the livery yard and back onto Silver Creek's main street, heading west toward the distant mountains. Sarah could feel the stares following them, could almost hear the whispers that would grow into rumors and legends with each retelling. "They're all watching," she murmured, resisting the urge to look back. "Let them watch," Dawson replied, his voice a rumble she could feel against her back. "By this time tomorrow, we'll be far beyond their judgment." He guided Midnight past the last buildings of Silver Creek, adding quietly, "I know a place in the high country, a cabin where we'll be safe while we figure out what comes next. As Silver Creek receded behind them, and the vast Montana landscape opened up ahead, Sarah felt a curious lightness in her chest. She had left behind everything familiar, tied her fate to a man whose real name she didn't even know for certain, and yet she felt more free than she had in months. Whatever lay ahead, danger, hardship, or perhaps something unexpected like happiness, it would be on her own terms. "What comes next, Mr. Dawson?" she said, settling more comfortably against him as midnight found his stride, "is entirely up to us." If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.